Hi everyone. So I am on video 3 for those of you that are following along. I really appreciate this. Um, I really have two purposes for these videos. One is to give parents and family members of children with disabilities or children that exhibit or engage in challenging behaviors, teachers, therapists, admin, um, basically anyone that works with children. The confident, powerful voice to advocate for their loved one. You're not alone. And the more awareness that we can bring to this world, the more hopefully you won't feel alone. Speaking of awareness, that's my second purpose. I want to teach awareness for students with disabilities. Daily I experience firsthand the lack of education around children who struggle academically, who struggle functionally, who struggle behaviorally, mentally, socially, and so on. It's just a lack of awareness, and it doesn't mean that that person who is judging is a bad person. It just means that they need more education, and that's what I really would love to do, is provide that education. So, and I'm going to try to embed a way in these videos to make a difference in the lives of these families, and a way to teach that awareness. So before I get into the book that I'm slightly obsessed with, for those of you that have been following along, you know that I have been reading Lost and Found by Dr. Greene, Ross W. Greene. Is a book about helping behaviorally challenging students. And, this book is not just about behaviorally challenging students. It's about anyone that is involved or affected by children that might engage in challenging behaviors. So, like I said, I believe in the first or second video, we're talking about every student in the classroom can benefit from these strategies that Dr. Greene talks about. So my first number one kind of tip to give the world, for those that are watching, is show compassion. Show compassion instead of judgment. Please. When you see, for example, a family or a parent or a grandparent or a loved one, anyone struggling with, a child having a meltdown, and those meltdowns might look different. They might look extreme. They might look scary. And they are. But instead of, your first instinct is to judge and to assume that it's maybe the parent's fault because they didn't teach them the right way, or the child is just being naughty. Instead of assuming that, put that aside and show compassion. You have no idea, even though that child may look like a child that should know right from wrong, maybe that child looks like they should understand consequences and how to behave socially acceptable. You don't know. You don't know the deficits that child may have. And so instead of judging, go up to that family member and say, it looks like you're struggling. Can I help you with anything? Can I get you something? Can I get you something from your van? Can I take your groceries to the car for you? Anything. The worst that could happen is that parent would say, no, thank you. Okay, then you did your good deed and you can walk on. But to judge and walk away and not do anything, walking away and doing nothing is one thing. I mean, we're all busy, I get that. But walking away and doing nothing and then judging without knowing anything is terrible. And so please show compassion instead of judging. Okay, so that's kind of my tip, my little soapbox. for today's video. The other thing I wanted to kind of touch on was Dr. Greene talks about, and I think I prefaced this in another video, but he talked about, zero tolerance policies have actually made things worse. And so he goes on to say, it's a jungle out there for behaviorally challenging kids. Many of the developments and initiatives that have come down the pike in the last 20 to 30 years have made it much harder for their teachers and other school staff to fulfill the role of a helper. And if you remember, a helper doesn't judge. A helper doesn't, going back to what a helper is, a helper helps. And some of the shifts that have come down the pike, like Dr. Greene says, has made it very difficult to help children effectively. He goes on to say, zero tolerance policies have made things worse. The research tells us it's so. Those policies turn potential helpers into disciplinary robots and cause them to respond to behavioral challenges with algorithms rather than rational thought, as adversaries rather than as partners, with consequences rather than collaboration. Although some school systems have abandoned those policies, they still resonate in the mindsets of many educators. Perhaps this explains why, in the United States alone, we will expel over 100,000 students from public school annually. And now this was written in 2016, so I'm not sure exactly the stats now, but 100,000 students from public school annually suspend more than 3 million times a year. That's probably an underestimate, he says. They dole out countless dozens of millions of detentions and discipline referrals every year. They use restraint and seclusion procedures 270,000 times a year. And believe it or not, in 19 states, they still apply corporal punishment hundreds of thousands of times a year. And unfortunately, it's disproportionately to the children of color. So he goes on to say, if anyone that's in the special education world or is in the education world or has a child that's in the special education world has heard of least restrictive environment, right? So, a child who is in their regular ed classroom with all their peers and they're teaching or learning right alongside of their peers is in their least restrictive environment. There's no other interventions in place. There's no other accommodations. They don't get pulled out for anything, and they just go about their day with the rest of their class. Now we know some students, they need additional help. And there's nothing wrong with that. And so sometimes they get pulled for reading, or sometimes they get pulled for math, or sometimes they get pulled for social help or behavioral help. So if that child is pulled from the classroom, then they're not necessarily in their least restrictive environment because we have given them an alternative place or a placement or a setting for them to learn. So nothing right or wrong. There's a lot of debate between that, and I'm not here to say anything about that. But he goes and says, one of the most important doctrines governing interventions for students who receive special education in the U.S. public schools is the principle of the least restrictive environment. He goes on and says, and this was a very aha moment, a similar doctrine, the least toxic response, should be applied to interventions for behaviorally challenging students. So I'll read that again. A similar doctrine, similar to the least restrictive environment, it should be the least toxic response, meaning the least toxic response to challenging behavior. He goes on and says detention, suspension, expulsion, paddling, restraint, seclusion, they fall into that most toxic category. And I would argue, and I would say intimidation, yelling, screaming at a child is also extremely toxic, especially if that yelling doesn't change the behavior. There is a time and a place to raise our voices at our students, our kids, whatever. But if you're doing it all the time and it isn't changing behavior, then it's not effective. Same thing with suspension. And I talked about that. If your child has repeated suspensions and there's no modifications in behavior, there's no changes in their behavior, and there's no increase in skills to help them, then that consequence isn't effective. It talks about restraint and seclusion, and I know there's a huge debate about that as well. Unfortunately, sometimes we have to restrain or seclude for the safety of that child or for others. But that is a major criteria that they have to meet. And every crisis management procedures, they have their own criteria, and we have our own criteria. So I won't get into that, but sometimes, and I mean sometimes, we have to do that. I work with a pretty challenging population, and I would say we do it a couple times a year. Maybe a little more sometimes, maybe a little less, but it's very rare we have to do it. And so if your child is being restrained or secluded on a daily basis over and over and over, then I encourage you, I want to give you the power to go in and ask for change, because that's not fair to that child. It's not fair to the teachers. It's not fair to the admin team. It's that hamster wheel. You're just going around and around and nothing is changing. So that was a lot. I meant to get a video Saturday and Sunday, and unfortunately I ran out of time. So my goal is to get at least 2 videos a week. Otherwise it might take us 10 years to get through this book. But hopefully some of you have picked it up and you are loving it just as much as I do. So I will see you soon.